Well, hello everyone. Welcome to EMF Solutions for Your Health. 6 essential steps to reduce electromagnetic fields and increase your health and well-being. This is a 6-part e-course. The first session today is EMF awareness, and it's really great to have you here. And we will have some question and answer times also, so that if you have questions, please keep track of your questions. So at the end, we can address your concerns. Okay, so here we are. Yes, we can reduce the unnatural EMFs around us and create a more natural and healthy environment. Just to let you know who I am, some of you may know me, but I have a degree in engineering, a degree in psychology. I'm a licensed electrical contractor, so I do a lot of the repairs, fixes, wiring, shielding. I've been doing it for 25 years and have a lot of experience with the really sensitive clients. I'm a bit sensitive myself, so I'm partly in this work because I'm sensitive. Also want to let you know that I'm an engineer, not a medical doctor or licensed healthcare practitioner. So all the information here is from my own review of the scientific literature and my own anecdotal experience with sensitive clients. And some of the assumptions of this course is that we're testing and treating the environment. This is not necessarily treating the person directly or medically. We're improving the environment to support the health of the individual. We're using evidence from real-world anecdotal experience with thousands of clients, and we're also using information that's backed up by scientific research, mostly that's independent from the industry funding. We'll get into that. Start out, Dr. Neil Cherry, the late Dr. Neil Cherry, his most famous statement, EMFs are a ubiquitous, universal, genotoxic carcinogen. He's meaning that they're pretty much everywhere, all the time, and that's one of the issues with EMFs. You can't really get away from them. He would say there is no safe threshold level. The only safe exposure level is 0. He did the original study showing increased cancer rates near the Sutro Tower. It's a big hill with the broadcast antennas for San Francisco. He also showed that chromosome breaks can be initiated by EMFs, which is something that conventional science still thinks is impossible, even though there's many studies showing it. He showed that the body's natural repair mechanisms are highly involved, affected, and ultimately overwhelmed by exposure to EMFs. Another important researcher is Sam Milham, and his statement, the strongest link to the emergence of childhood leukemia in modern cultures is the original electrification of homes. He's a research scientist with the Washington State Department of Health. He realized that all the modern studies tend to compare higher exposures of EMFs to controls, but those controls are still modern people who have a lot of EMF exposure. So what he did is go back in time looking at the records, and he noticed that childhood leukemia is pretty much non-existent in pre-modern cultures, and it is now one of the modern affluence diseases. So basically he found that you find leukemia in children occurring just a few years right after any area, country, state, blacks versus white, when their homes are electrified. That's when childhood leukemia shows up. Dr. Lisa, when I treat my sensitive patients, they usually feel better, but if they go back into their high EMF homes with all the wireless, my treatments don't last as long. After a short period of time, they will feel bad again and need more treatment sooner. It is hard to help people when their own environment undoes much of the positive healing work I do for them. So I tell them that they need to reduce the EMFs and get rid of the wireless, or at least turn it off at night. So a lot of doctors, alternative doctors now, and regular doctors too, are starting to take interest in this and seeing that the EMFs are affecting people's health. So the course will have these 6 steps. Today is about awareness. What are EMFs? What are the health effects? The 5 sessions after this will be very specifically about reducing the EMFs, the different kind of solutions, for the particular kinds of EMFs, but today we're looking at the general idea of what EMFs are, where they come from, what the biological mechanisms might be, things about hypersensitivity, so that you have a background to proceed from. The second session will be on magnetic fields. The third session will be on radio frequencies. That's all the wireless. Fourth session will be on electric fields. This is kind of the unknown, uncharted country where not that many studies have been done, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence showing health effects from the electric field part of the EMFs. Step 5 is, I call it EMFs with steroids. This is when you mix different kinds of EMFs together to form dirty electricity, modulated RF signals, and we're going to be looking at solutions to that. Not easy, but we're going to be looking at what can we do. And step 6, the sixth session, EMF health. Things like earthing, EMF protection devices, what works, and we'll be kind of looking at how to put it all together. You have all these different kinds of EMFs. What's your sort of, how do you basically make a plan to reduce everything? So this session, let's start with what are the EMFs, the 3 kinds of EMFs. Because basically, whenever we're talking about EMFs, we actually have to be aware that we have to be careful what we're talking about. EMF is a very general term, electromagnetic field. So, and the reason we kind of split into 3 different kinds of EMFs is that they each have different properties, require different kind of test instruments and different kinds of shielding or repairs or different solutions. So it helps to have, once you understand these 3 types, you can pretty much handle almost all the EMFs that are out there. Let's start with the electric fields. We won't get into right now ELF and VLF, but we will soon. Electric fields is the half of the electromagnetic field. The name electromagnetic has it in there. So electromagnetic fields are actually a combination of electric and magnetic. This is just the electric part. And this is the part that's pretty much, electricity. Lightning is an obvious source of electricity, a burst of electricity running from the clouds to the earth or a cloud to cloud. Static electricity. This is some fun examples of, what happens to your hair if you get a charge, electric charge on you. That's what we call static electricity, or DC. Static electricity is DC, which means direct current. It's not changing. If you're positively charged, if your hair is positively charged, like the first cat in this picture, and it stays that way. But our electric power is AC, it's alternating current. So you think of your hair is like pushed up and then down, up, down, up, down, up, down by a changing field. So it's switching. DC is the same, AC is switching. And our electricity in the world here is usually 50 or 60 times per second that switching happens. And that's actually what most of the health effects have to do with. It's that switching back and forth, positive to negative, or magnetic from North Pole to South Pole. And these kind of switching, these AC electric fields, they're not just here for this particular cat. They're everywhere. So this room might look pretty simple, but there's electric fields from the wire in the wall. If you open up the walls, you'd see things like this. There's wires in there, usually unshielded, making these electric fields all the time. Then the other part of the electromagnetic field is the magnetic field. And magnetism we're pretty aware of, pretty used to. The magnetic field of the planet is like a big DC magnet. DC, again, direct current. The Earth's magnetic field is mostly DC with, with the stationary, non-changing North and South Pole. So the North Pole is the North Pole, the South Pole is the South Pole. It's not changing. Over millions of years that changes, but for us, it's effectively stays the same. So your compass needle always points north. So if the magnetic field was completely AC, like our electricity, where we have north and south changing and east and positive and negative changing, if the magnetic field was like their AC electric of our electricity, you would see the compass needle actually flip back and forth, back, forth, back, forth. In the United States here, 60 times a second. In Europe and most of the world, 50 times a second. This compass needle would be reversing and flipping back and forth. That's the changing field. That's the issue with EMFs that we're mostly dealing with. It turns out the Earth's field does have an AC part. If your compass is sensitive enough, you could actually see this needle wiggle a little bit, 60 times, actually about 7, 8, 9, 10 times a second. We'll get to that. But there is a little bit of the Earth's magnetic field that is not totally steady. There's actually an AC part, an alternating part. And that happens whenever electricity strikes the Earth. Here we're looking at, this is basically the magnetosphere of the planet, and the ionosphere is very similar. Whenever lightning strikes the Earth, this chamber of the ionosphere vibrates. It's kind of like ringing a bell. The ionosphere is like a bell of the atmosphere, and when lightning strikes, it's like the striker in this bell hitting this bell. It resonates. That's what's called the Schumann resonance. You may have heard of that. That Schumann resonance is just simply lightning strikes, and the electromagnetic phenomena, it rings kind of like a bell between the ionosphere and the surface of the Earth. And it gives us this interesting frequency of around 7.8 hertz, which we'll talk about what that means. This frequency of the Earth's magnetic field pulsing, that pulsing is called ELF, extremely low frequency. That's the scientific name given. So ELF stands for extremely low frequency. And the fields that we're talking about so far, the magnetic and the electric, we're talking about ELF, electric, and ELF, magnetic. I like to think of I think of it more as Earth-like fields. These are planet fields. I also think of it like Earth-loving fields because it turns out life has a lot of connection to these ELF magnetic fields. That Schumann resonance, if you can see on my diagram here, these are brain waves, slower, faster, but you see that Schumann resonance is right kind of at the same kind of frequency between theta waves and alpha waves of our brain. So our brains are operating at some very similar frequencies to the Earth. Here we see an interesting little diagram. Again, the Schumann resonance is right in there in that 7, 8, 9, 10 hertz kind of range. We'll get to what hertz means in a second. So one of the issues with ELF fields, extremely low frequency, Earth-like, Earth-loving, Earth-living, they're all, first, our brain waves and those of all animals with sufficiently developed brains have very similar frequencies to these micropulsations of the Earth's magnetic field. So it's not just our brain, it's the whole animal kingdom. So here's one of the issues. What about the power line fields, for instance? Well, it turns out ELF is also electricity fields, artificial fields. So all our electricity at 60 hertz in North America, 50 hertz in most of the world. This ELF is very similar to the Earth's ELF. And if you were to put our electrical system on where the human brain waves are, you can see that it's right in that very fast brain wave sort of region. So we're talking about now getting even above beta waves and into the gamma waves, very quick waves of the brain. So our power lines are, so the sources besides power lines, everything with electricity. Here we have a electric meter and the distribution panel. Here again, that same room, you've got magnetic fields typically coming from the hidden wiring in the wall. And you think a neighbor like this, no power line in sight, no magnetic fields, not necessarily true. This neighborhood, typically over here on this side or over here on this side, you're going to have electrical wires buried, feeding each house. Each house is going to have an electrical lateral going to it. And those electrical lines can have just as much magnetic fields as the ones that you see in the air. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. So that's one of the reasons that we rely on test meters to help us find out what the magnetic fields are, because you could never guess by looking at a neighborhood like this. So both the electric and magnetic fields we've been talking about are ELF. So some of the sources of ELF magnetic fields now that we've covered, we have power lines, wiring, panels, electrical system in the house, the Earth itself. And the other thing we haven't talked about, actually, if you have sensitive enough equipment, you could pick up the ELF magnetic fields that are emitted by the brain. To give you an idea, The Earth's field is about 1,000 times weaker than these kind of sources of the power lines and the wiring. So, but it is there, but it's weak. And then our own brain signals like another similar factor of like 1,000, 10,000 times more weaker. But if you had the right equipment, you could detect brain waves, the magnetic brain waves from people. It's been done. It's been done with superconducting magnetic sensors. So the third kind of EMF is the radio frequencies, and this is the big thing that's really increasing these days. So the radio frequencies, we actually know a lot of the EMF spectrum already. So if you were looking at this rainbow, you'd think that's all there is to the, you might not even know that actually the light from the rainbow is electromagnetic, but actually that's just one tiny part of the whole electromagnetic spectrum, what you see there. Here in this diagram, if you look at the rainbow colors here, there's a lot more to the electromagnetic spectrum. And that's what we're talking about today, is some of the other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. One of the kind of EMFs that you've heard about are on this end: ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays, cosmic rays. Those are very high frequencies, very short little wavelengths, high frequencies that carry a lot of energy. That's the really dangerous kind of radiation that everybody agrees is trouble. And the other side here are all the kinds of radiations or electromagnetic fields that have been considered quite safe until recently. They're called non-ionizing because they don't have enough energy to ionize molecules, so they thought, oh, they're safe. Infrared light radiation, that's the normal stuff, the normal radiation from this. You feel the sun's heat, or you feel the heat of a wood-burning stove. That's infrared. That's just below the visible part of the rainbow. If you could see it, you'd see infrared. You can feel it, though. You can feel it. And that is relatively safer. It's been around for a long time. Not too many known health impacts from that. And then those ELF and VLF, we'll get to VLF in the second session. The ELF magnetic fields are also non-ionizing. So those magnetic fields we talked about, they fit way over here in this end of the spectrum, very low frequencies. And the ELF electric fields are also way at that end of the spectrum. So you think, wow, these are the really, so you can understand why some people, the scientists would say, hey, if gamma rays and X-rays are over here, these guys got to be really safe. That's kind of the thinking that people tend to have. But of course, what we're pointing out here is that they're in that same frequency range of these magnetic fields and electric fields. There's our brain waves, typically in the range of 1 hertz to 30 hertz, but even a little more. And similarly, there's those magnetic micropulsations of the Earth. Those are also non-ionizing ELF fields. So the radio frequency fields, where are they? So they fit in this spectrum. They're lower frequencies than infrared, but they're higher frequencies than the magnetic and electric fields, the ELF fields. So these are the kind of 3 EMFs we're talking about. This is what we're concerned about. ELF magnetic fields, ELF electric fields, and the radio frequency fields. The radio frequency fields is a very wide range of frequencies. We'll even get to what frequency means. But so it's quite a collection. We can kind of lump them together because in some ways they have similar properties, but actually every frequency has slightly different properties also. So that's where it gets interesting when you're trying to shield or work with radio frequencies. Depending on the particular frequency, it'll have different physical characteristics. The radio frequency fields, of course, you know the obvious examples: cell towers, these microwave dishes. And then you, of course, again have cell towers a little more hidden. So, and then this one here, you wouldn't maybe know, but that's a cell tower. And these are all cell towers. These are all cell towers. So they're pretty much ubiquitous now. They're everywhere. And now they're even showing up a lot on power poles, telephone poles, pretty much, the tops of commercial buildings. And of course, cell phones and very common exposure. For a lot of us, that's the highest exposure because that phone is so close to our head. But now it's even commonly, where pregnant women might use wireless computer. We have a lot of sources. We have Wi-Fi, we have cordless phones, we have smart meters. Cars now have radar installed for proximity safety purposes. You might even go, well, I know smart meters a source. Which is the real RF source here? Well, you probably guess all of them. In this case, a Wi-Fi TV, components here that have wireless in it, a wireless Wi-Fi refrigerator. A lot of them are coming that way now. And it's everywhere. So here we have a man from New Guinea who is showing off his wireless devices. So before we go any further, what is electromagnetism? Fields, radiation, waves? Well, actually, those are all terms for the same thing. We tend to call these fields electromagnetic fields, not so much radiation, and then things like X-rays and nuclear radiation we tend to call radiation, but actually you could interchange those words and be scientifically correct. So basically the way to think about electromagnetic fields is waves. It's kind of a wave. There's all kinds of waves in nature, the waves on a lake or an ocean, the sound waves we hear, which is just waves, pressure waves in the air, electromagnetic fields. Frequency is one of the characteristics of waves. And basically what you do is you count how many waves in a period of time. How many times is the wave coming at you? This is usually called cycles per second. In the United States, our electricity is 60 cycles per second. We call that 60 hertz. To give you an idea how there's all different frequencies, your Wi-Fi router typically operates at 2.4 gigahertz. That's 2,400,000,000 cycles per second. So the wave comes through 2.4 billion times a second is it coming through. Very different kinds of EMFs. If you're kind of wondering, well, how would you calculate, what is frequency again? Well, here's a bunch of surfers and the waves are coming in. And here, the surfer guy here, if he had his watch on and he said, how many of these waves are going to come through in a minute? And then he'd find 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 swells came through. He would say, there's 4 swells per minute, or there's a frequency of 4 per minute. So that's how you calculate frequency. You just measure how many of those waves come through, whether that's a water wave or a sound wave or an electromagnetic wave. Then you have wavelength. You can measure that's the distance, for instance, in our last example, from the crest of one wave to the next. Shorter wavelengths are often higher frequencies. That'll be something we'll get into later. Longer wavelengths usually mean lower frequencies. To give you an idea, the wavelength of that Schumann frequency, that 7.8 hertz we talked about, that natural micropulsation of the Earth's magnetic field, that wavelength is 24,000 miles. So you're talking about even bigger than the planet. We call it planet size. That's a planet-sized field. Now the wavelength of your Wi-Fi router, that 2.4 gigahertz, that wavelength, the size of that wave is 5 inches. So you see that's a people-sized field. That's a body-sized field. And that probably has something to do with some of the ways that RF energy, these radio frequencies, affect us, is because in some ways we're fairly good antennas for it. We're the right size. If you wanted to measure the wavelength here, that same situation, if the surfer over here had a tape measure and send it over here, we would just go, oh, yep, that looks like 30 feet or whatever that measurement is. That's simply what the wavelength is. You can measure that. And then, of course, waves also have energy. They carry energy. Like if you have a big storm, the waves at the ocean or a lake could totally erode the coastline. Waves from electromagnetic fields can heat you up. And you can measure these strengths, just like you can measure the height of a wave in the ocean. In this case, in this example, you might have maybe a 3 or 4 foot wave. In a case like this, you might have, could that be a 30-foot wave perhaps? Very different strengths of waves. And then there's information. The other thing that waves do is they can carry information. Like if you were counting how many waves per minute were coming into the shore. I grew up on lakes, and I would count. I could see the waves come by. The natural waves come in. Then a speedboat would go by, and suddenly there's more waves, quicker, and they're bigger waves. I wouldn't have to even look at the that I would not have to see the boat or hear the boat just by seeing the waves up. That was a motorboat. You can just tell there's information in the waves by looking at it. The faster frequency, the bigger intensity. The ocean could be calm where I am at the coast here right now, but the big swells might tell me that there's a really big storm out there, perhaps thousands of miles away. Waves carry information, just like the sound waves we hear, they carry information. And living organisms use information from waves in a very sophisticated manner, whether it is visual or sound waves or electromagnetic waves. So here's an example of some waves coming in versus this example here where you have, you can't kind of tell anything from it because it's all scattered, but you could tell that it's very calm here and there's probably a big storm causing these big swells, could be 1,000 miles away. Case you can just look at it, you know it's windy, you know it's rough. You don't have to be there to know what the conditions are. So waves tell you a lot. And then the last thing, interference. Say you were watching those waves coming in, and what if you had a control system in your own brain and you noticed that the waves were faster during the day and slower at night? That's a kind of information. What if your brain decided that, okay, I'll sleep when the waves are slower and I'll be awake and do my daytime things when the waves are faster? So that's actually, in a way, somewhat, it looks like how our brain works as far as regulating day-night sleep functions, is by changes in the Earth's magnetic field. So in this example, if you're just actually looking at the waves on the ocean, and what if a speedboat goes by and makes these taller, faster waves? Would that cause interference? If your brain was trying to go, is it night or day? Maybe it gets a little harder to figure out, is it time to sleep or not? I can't tell. The waves are kind of interrupted or being overwhelmed. That's what magnetic fields can do, or any of the fields can do. They can maybe overwhelm our sensing functions that are trying to make sense of the world. And also, what if the wind whips up the water and it's so turbulent you can't see the waves very well anymore? That's a kind of interference or maybe a stress for you also. And that might be similar to something we're going to get into, which is called dirty electricity. So here again, you have a situation where you can kind of read the waves, and here it's hard to make sense of what's going on. Information is being kind of all jumbled by in this case is the wind. In the case of electromagnetic fields, might be dirty electricity. When the three different kinds of EMFs mix together, sometimes that's when you have the biggest health impacts, perhaps. This hasn't been researched really well, but basically dirty electricity, or if you see DE, that's just the abbreviation. Dirty electricity is when radio frequencies get mixed up with the ELF electric fields. That's something that's reduced by dirty electricity filters. Then there's dirty magnetic fields. You should actually say dirty magnetic. That is actually something that's not addressed, not very well known. It's when the radio frequency pollutes the ELF magnetic fields. And actually, it's something that's often caused by dirty electricity filters. So that's why I'm very cautious about using filters to deal with dirty electricity, is because it cleans up one kind of dirty EMF issue, but it actually tends to create another dirty EMF issue. And so we have to be careful. And then there's pulsed and modulated RF. These are the radio frequencies that are the digital things that we use for most things today, like our cell phones and Wi-Fi. They are pulsed and modulated in interesting ways. And a lot of times the pulsing is happening at ELF frequencies. So even though you have that 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi signal, it might be being pulsed on and off, turned on and off at maybe 100 times a second. That's an ELF frequency. And so what happens is almost all of the new digital things are kind of creating a new hybrid. I call it super ELF, or artificial field. It's like an ELF and it's like an RNF. It's like an ELF and it's like an RF field, but it's kind of a mixture. And I think for our human nervous system, it's kind of intense. So again, dirty electricity occurs when the ELF magnetic and electric fields carry some of the radio frequencies. So it's basically when magnetic fields are made dirty, and they call it dirty in electronics. Instead of being a clean sine wave, it's now carrying along radio frequencies. There's another thing piggybacking along with it. And the other thing we talked about, when the radio frequencies fields are pulsed at the lower ELF frequencies, it makes them into kind of a super kind of ELF hybrid also, which is another, who knows how that combination of the two affects our health. So before we go on any further, just wanted to allow people to, if you wanted to chat in the chat box, any questions, and we might take a little break here too in a few minutes, but I just wanted to, in fact, let's do that. Let's just take a quick, maybe a 3-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll look at if anybody has chatted any questions that they want me addressed before we go on. We could do that. Okay, hello everyone. I am back and I'm looking at the chat and a couple things, but lost sound. Probably, sorry if I didn't explain that. Just took a quick break to give everybody a break. Okay, you hear me again. Okay, perfect. Very good. Yes, so maybe if everybody, if you just chime in, if you are hearing me and seeing the screen now, just to make sure before we go on. But let's see, I haven't had any sound from the beginning. Okay. Sorry about that, not sure why. It may be that if there was no sound, it may be that actually, I'm not sure what your user control looks like. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, very good. Thanks, Satya. So, Bo, I'm thinking, I think we'll start off here again. Welcome everybody back. I'll take a few questions. I'm going to take a few questions before we go on. Oh, I'm thinking magnetico sleep pad. Oh, and let's see, you are all DC or steady state mag fields okay. The general thinking is that magnetic fields, the DC type, like the Earth's magnetic field, north and south pole, unchanging, is no problem. We're used to it. It's a strong field. It's a natural thing for us. We use, a lot of animals use it to migrate, to navigate. So it's a very common field. It's considered safe. In fact, like the Magnetico sleep pad, you're actually using magnetic fields, hopefully in a healthy way, for health purposes, for supporting the body with that magnetic field. That's a DC field, normally considered anything from safe to healthy. Let's see. I've been working with him. Okay, still have any sound. Sorry about that. Can you address Bluetooth technology and dangers? So we will get. I'll answer that a little bit right now, and then go on. In the third session, we're going to be focusing on radio frequency issues, everything to do with radio frequency. So Bluetooth falls into that, and it is an issue. It's another wireless device. The good thing about it is that it's a relatively weaker signal, only meant to go a short distance, 6 feet, 10 feet. You're not sending it, half a mile or a mile to a cell tower. So it's a lower level field than a lot of other things, except when you're wearing it. When you actually have like a Bluetooth device on your body or in your ear, that part of your body can still be getting quite a high level. So I tend to think of when you're wearing a Bluetooth device at all, it's kind of like having a cell phone or a cordless phone right at your head. To that part of your ear and part of your brain right there, the measurements are not that different. So I really consider Bluetooth to be problematic, and always looking for ways to avoid any wireless, even Bluetooth. So I've read that the Schumann resonance has spiked to 36 hertz. Have you heard anything about that? Does the 7-point hertz vary? Yes, very good. Perfect question, Bo. That's coming right up. So I think we'll just let the webinar address that. But yes, that Schumann resonance varies greatly. It's a natural phenomena. So depending on what's going on the planet, there's quite a lot of variation. That 7.8 hertz is just sort of the middle of the range of the frequencies that are involved. Okay. So let's proceed. So let's cover some of the common health effects. A lot of you are aware of the health effects, and some of you are probably dealing with them yourself. Nancy Wertheimer, here's her first paper on the relationship between power lines and childhood leukemia was the proverbial butterfly's wing that began a far-reaching cascade of further research. So she's the one that actually looked at kids' leukemia. Why are kids having leukemia? Could there be an environmental cause? She was driving around in her old car, not making much money. What could it be? A really sincere person, and noticed that when she went to the houses where children had died in the Denver area, an unusual number of them had transformers right there. And she started to figure out that, there's something to do with the electricity system. He teamed up with Ed Leeper. He's an extremely gifted and pioneering research scientist. He's actually my teacher. He's the one that got me started with understanding magnetic fields. He was ridiculed by the electrical industry and forced basically to continue his life work in other areas, which has happened to a lot of the really, really smart, clever, bright scientists in this field. Basically, they did the first study that linked leukemia, childhood leukemia, to magnetic fields from power lines back in 1979. That was confirmed by Savitz in 1988, working for the Electric Power Research Institute. He repeated the study and got the same results. There's a Swedish study that also found similar results, 2 milligauss, magnetic fields linked to childhood leukemia. So Wertheimer and Leeper were the ones that really got it started, that there are links to cancer in actually children and adults from power lines, which of course now we know is much more than power lines. The magnetic fields are emitted by all kinds of things. One of the things to consider is that the EMF science has been severely suppressed, and the actual health impacts may be much greater than we realize. So one of the best sources I think there is to find out information is the Bioinitiative report. You go to bioinitiative.org. This is a report that's been updated a few times. It's by scientists in the field who do research, who are concerned that today's safety guidelines are too lenient and do not address the relatively low levels of EMF exposure that are found to affect human health in their studies. Many of these scientists were actually afraid to speak out on their own, but they came together as a group to have more power and safety as making the recommendations. So they have a quite good list of the different studies. I'm just picking out a couple here. This is studies that have to do with radio frequency exposure. So here we're looking at levels of 0.00034 microwatts per centimeter squared. Quite a low level by today's standards. Almost very few houses hardly even have that level anymore, because this is a relatively low level. Chronic exposure to mobile phone, pulsed RF again, significantly reduced sperm count. So you start to see reproductive effects. 0.003 microwatts. In children and adolescents, short-term exposure caused headaches, irritation, concentration difficulties, conduct problems, behavioral problems. Again, you see effects on kids often as being at some of the lowest levels of exposure. And I had this slide here because here's where you see the first link to cancer at 0.2 microwatts per centimeter squared, and we'll get into that in the upcoming webinars, the different exposure levels for the different kinds of fields. But for these radio frequency fields, here radio frequency radiation caused a doubling of leukemia in children, and also affected the survival of children who already had leukemia. Is just more information from the Bioinitiative report if you want to get into some of the studies. But to just give you a little idea of the many kind of effects that EMFs have been linked to, we have sleep issues, all kinds of sleep issues. Sometimes in severe cases, the night-day biorhythms really get off a schedule. Mental and emotional issues, fatigue, memory problems, dizziness, even seizures, irritation, anxiety. And in the studies, depression and suicide are increased. Physical fatigue, nausea, pain, inflammation. Some people feel like a burning, but instead of on the skin, like from a sunburn, it's almost like you're sunburned from the inside. So inflammation, redness, itching, pain, burning sensations. Some of the interesting effects that people are reporting and are showing up in the studies, effects on blood pressure, heart rate variability, and heart arrhythmias. Another thing that really irritates people sometimes is a kind of a tinnitus, or hearing certain sounds that appear to be related to the radio frequencies in some cases. I've had cases where I take my audio detector radio frequency meter, and it basically turns the RF, the modulation, the way the signal is turned on and off electronically into a sound. And I've had people go, oh, that's what I hear. It was their cordless phone system or whatever the source was. So it's real. People do have these sound phenomena. There's even one called microwave hearing. Sensitivity increases, sensitivity to sounds, vibrations, foods, chemicals, scents, stress. And actually one of the things that EMFs are linked to are stress hormones, stress responses, cortisol, heat shock proteins, hormonal changes, basically feeling stressed out and overwhelmed. Reproductive effects, some of the strongest evidence for EMF health effects is from miscarriages and birth defects. And of course, the various cancers, childhood leukemia being the most often linked to EMF effects, but also for adults, and a lymphoma and brain and nervous system tumors, even male breast cancer. So it's interesting when you see male breast cancer go up as a result of EMF exposure, you kind of wonder how much female breast cancer might be linked to EMFs. Also have suppression of the immune system, cell changes, leakage of the blood-brain barrier, effects on brain waves, possible connections with Lou Gehrig's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and Lyme disease. And you can even go, how could EMFs affect so many different things? We'll kind of get to that in a minute. I consider EMFs probably at least as much of a problem as smoking cigarettes and some of the other things that we know are unhealthy. And especially for children, some of the strongest evidence is miscarriage and birth defects. That's some of the first evidence that showed up. Whatever the mother is doing, the child is doing. If the mother is on a wireless laptop, so is her infant growing in her. For those health effects, the study suggests that EMFs may be linked to a variety of health problems, including leukemia, lymphoma, brain and nervous system cancers, melanoma, breast cancer, miscarriage, birth defects, Alzheimer's disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, depression, suicide. Anecdotally, EMFs have been associated with symptoms such as nausea, headache, fatigue, anxiety, dizziness, mental confusion, memory loss, sleep disturbance, seizures, tinnitus, changes to blood pressure and heart rate, itchy or burning skin sensations, and skin rashes. These are all really common complaints. There are increasing numbers of people who report hypersensitivity to electromagnetic fields, similar to the way that many individuals have become hypersensitive to chemicals and other environmental toxins, often as a result from overexposure in the past. Something I see all the time, the people who are really highly sensitive now, almost always you can trace back to some really big exposure, something where they had been like living too close to a power line for years, or sleeping in a room that had really high electric fields for 10 years, and lo and behold, at some point, they become the sensitive ones. A little bit about the studies. Here's Dr. Henry Lay, the University of Washington. He looked at the radio frequency studies and found that if the study is not sponsored by the industry, a harmful effect is reported 70% of the time of those studies. But almost the exact opposite, when it's the industry-funded studies, it's almost the exact opposite. Almost 70% say there's no effect. So you can start to see already what happens with the money. Industry studies tend to use shorter time periods in their studies, which tends to hide, miss, or obscure the long-term health effects. You have a cancer that instead of growing for 20 years, now because the EMFs shows up harming a person in 10 years, you do a 5-year study and you never even find that effect. Categorize subjects who use cordless phones and other wireless devices as unexposed. That's another common thing. Heavy users of cell phones, also known as very light users today, were found to have an approximately doubled risk of glioma. That's a very serious brain cancer after 10 years of cell phone use. So basically, when I and here Dr. Mercola look at this kind of study, it looks like if you have a cancer that develops in 20 years, say, it looks like with the influence of EMFs, that cancer might develop in 10 years. Kind of a rough idea what we see happening. Andy Marino, there's a really good book if you want to read what I call the sausage making of EMF science and research, his book, Going Somewhere, The Truth About a Life in Science. He documented some of the lack of integrity in the EMF research industry. He was also trained by Dr. Becker, who we'll get to in a second. And just to give you an idea, of course, you probably know this already, but if we took some measurements, I did this on a cell phone I have about a week ago. I measured in European units from the cell phone, 100,000 microwatts per meter squared. And then with some shielding, 22,000, a foot away, 5,000, 2 feet away, 600. But look, some of those studies that we said earlier, reduced sperm count at 3, behavioral changes in children at 30, lowest level linked to cancer, 2,000. So it gets, and then over here we have the safety level that we're currently using. So you can see that our exposures are much higher than the studies show have effects and much lower than the safety levels. So what could be those biological mechanisms? How could that be? If you're going to read any book and you want to understand sort of the how EMFs work, how the planet works, how our bodies pick it up, how interference works, Dr. Robert Becker, his 2 books, The Body Electric and Cross Currents, even though those are fairly old books, they are still the Bible for understanding EMFs. He's like, I would call him like the Freud of EMF research. He was an orthopedic surgeon and researcher. And he is another one of the really bright scientists after expressing, in other words, he was doing quite a lot of amazing research, but after expressing concerns about power lines and their health issues, he lost all of his research funding, was forced to retire in his 50s when he otherwise would have been at the height, beginning the height of his career. So he lost funds. Other researchers who did not report adverse health effects continue to be funded with many millions of dollars. He was the original genius of EMF research. He discovered new electric and magnetic properties in the body and the nerves. He discovered that limb generation in salamanders is ruled by electric fields, and several of the communications in the nerves in the bodies as well by electrical and magnetic phenomena. Using that information, he invented bone healing technology using DC electric currents that are still used today for healing fractures that are not responding well to normal treatment. And he correctly predicted the discovery of magnetic sense organs in humans. So, how could this all happen? Well, it turns out, let's take homing pigeons. They actually have two ways to navigate. They have a visual sense and a magnetic sense. An interesting study took pigeons, they blinded their eyes, and lo and behold, the pigeons still got to their target. But the researchers noticed that they didn't fly directly. They kind of flew like north-south, east-west, and they kind of wondered, hey, could it be like they're following the magnetic field of the planet? So the researchers put a magnet, this is interference, something that would interfere with their magnetic sense, if they had one, on their heads. They taped it to their heads, basically, and lo and behold, when the pigeons were blinded so they couldn't see, and they were basically blinded by magnetic interference, they could no longer find their way. And in fact, in those studies, about a week or two later, when the magnets fell off, the pigeons then returned. So research here has proven that we definitely have a sixth or magnetic sense. I call it a sixth sense, our magnetic sense. It's real. We all have it. And it turns out that it looks like humans have two ways of knowing night from day. One is the visual, the light we get through our eyes. Is it dark or light? But it also looks like there's a magnetic sense. All animals sufficiently evolved to have a brain, have brain waves that mimic the natural magnetic frequencies of the Earth. And studies show that our pineal glands can sense small changes in the Earth's magnetic field. For example, these day-night variations of the Earth's magnetic field, and uses information to regulate our circadian rhythms. In other words, artificial AC magnetic fields can now, it's known, it's shown in the studies, can suppress the secretion of melatonin from our pineal gland at night, similar to the way that light at night can affect our melatonin at sleep. It's very similar. So the receivers, or the receiving antennas, the sensors of magnetic fields, whales, slugs, pigeons, people. And again, you have an electric strike on the planet, and there's thousands of them every minute, all the time. And what's interesting about the Schumann resonance, so on the side of the planet towards the sun, where you have a smaller ionosphere, you have a smaller cavity, and away from the sun, you have like a bigger bell again, right? You have a bigger cavity. So it's kind of like ringing a bell. In the daytime, it's like ringing a smaller bell. You get a higher pitched frequency. At night, it's like ringing a bigger bell. You get a lower pitched frequency. So there's information there. There's again, that Schumann resonance, even though it averages at around 7.8, it's a very widely varying thing with time of day and what's going on the planet, how many electrical storms. But it does carry information. Natural EMFs are vital to life, and our brains even have a magnetic. So, when melatonin is suppressed or dysregulated, our sleep and rejuvenation cycles are adversely affected, and a diverse range of issues can result. So in other words, when we see all those different health issues, it seems, how could EMFs somehow cause all those issues? Well, it turns out, if all it does, and there's more, I'm sure, but if all it did was dysregulate somehow our sleep and wake cycle by affecting melatonin, all of those effects could come from that, everything from irritability and headaches to all kinds of health issues, memory problems from lack of sleep or lack of good sleep. And what's interesting is the suppression of melatonin is also linked to increased risk for several forms of cancer. And it's probably because melatonin itself is a potent natural cancer fighter. So we are messing with nature. The pineal gland regulates melatonin secretion using two known environmental inputs. They are the visible light, blue light that we see, and also the ELF micropulsations of the Earth's magnetic field. That's looking how it is. The research is tending that way. The pineal gland uses this input to regulate the day-night patterns of all the other glands. So the proposed biological mechanism for electromagnetic interference, BEMI, I would call it, electromagnetic interference, EMI, is actually a commonly experienced problem with computers, electronics, and electrical systems. Any engineer knows this. You have to be careful about electromagnetic interference with electronic systems. Yet electromagnetic interference is routinely denied, misunderstood, and often even ignored for how it might affect the bioelectronics of living organisms and our nervous systems. If you said that the only possible EMF effect for a computer or electronics or electrical system would be when the EMFs are so strong that they actually heat up the device, you would be laughed at. Because, of course, engineers would say, oh, you don't have to have that strong of a field, just anything that interferes can upset the working of the device. But if you said that the only possible adverse EMF effects for a human nervous system are when the EMFs are so strong that they actually heat up the device, you would actually be stating the current paradigm or belief system that scientists are using. And interesting, the safety standards for protecting computers and electronics as a result from unwanted electromagnetic interference are actually stricter than the present protections in place for human life. So in our current safety paradigm, you can guess which devices experience EMI. In the current safety paradigm, they would say your cell phone, yes, that building electronic system, yes, but your head, no. In our current safety paradigm, which devices are protected more from EMF? Well, of course, the cell phone, the building, but not your head, because it's not considered a bioelectronic system that could be interfered with. In our current safety paradigm, which one of these needs to be heated for any effect? So obviously not the phone, not the building, but yep, your brain, it actually has to be heated. So that's why the exposure standards, the safety limits are so relatively such high levels, because those are the high levels are what you need to heat up your body. The lower levels that show up in the study are what's needed to interfere with some of the functions. If you said that only the thermal heating could cause operational problems, you would be ridiculed if you said that about the building or the phone, but not if you said that about the brain. So conventional science is still using a heating model, a thermal model, while the real EMF mechanism is probably electromagnetic interference with our natural bioelectromagnetic functions. Once you consider interference, the seemingly low EMF levels can have a huge impact, disrupt sleep, suppress immune function, increase cancer, and the biological mechanisms become more obvious and many possibilities. So again, which is the more complex and sensitive device? I would vote for the one on the right and the one that probably needs more protection. Hypersensitivity. So this is a big issue. Here's Nikola Tesla. So he's saying alpha waves in the human brainwave are between 6 and 8 hertz. This again is that similarity between the human brainwaves and the Schumann resonance of the planet. And he says the wave frequency of the human cavity resonates between 6 and 8 hertz. All biological systems operate at the same frequency range. The human brain's alpha waves function in this range, and the electrical resonance of the Earth is between 6 and 8 hertz. Thus, our entire biological system, the brain and the Earth itself, work on the same frequencies. So even at the same turn of the century, that was known. If we can control that resonance system electronically, we can directly control the entire mental system of humankind. That's a little scary. So Nikola Tesla was the inventor of modern electricity. I would also say he was the inventor of modern electromagnetic sensitivity. I would pretty much declare him as the first human to experience EMF sensitivity syndrome, as I would call it. He had many of the classic signs of electromagnetic poisoning and was deathly ill for significant periods of his life. So we don't have time probably to get into all the things about electromagnetic sensitivity because we're going to be focusing on this course about what to do, how to reduce exposures. But just to let you know, I do have a guide, EMF hypersensitivity, and you can find that at the website if you don't have that already. Covers things like what are some of the symptoms, who is electrosensitive, how do you know if you are sensitive to EMFs? That's an important one. Often it's great to people figure it out because they feel better in one place and then they come home and they feel worse, or they feel bad when they got the new router, that kind of thing. And often we do a kind of a challenge test to get all the EMFs away from somebody for a week even. And then they go back to their usual thing and you see the difference. And that's often the way we figure out the EMF sensitivity. Definition of electromagnetic sensitivity. Why does it take several days to check for EMF sensitivity? Because a lot of the things that happen for people, the nervous system effects, when you remove the EMF, it often takes for healthy young people hours before the nervous system comes back to normal, and for older people or people with more health challenges, it takes days sometimes. I had a client who just said, all this work, it didn't work. I feel horrible. And then the 7th day, it's a miracle. Thank you. It took her that long to kind of process whatever the effects were on her body. What is the cause of EMF sensitivity? What kind of person is likely to become sensitive? EMF sensitivity varies greatly. Some of the general advice to relieve symptoms of EMF sensitivity. So in this, I also outline some of the safe levels for magnetic fields. You can't really say for a sensitive person what's absolutely safe, but we have some idea of what our targets are. And another thing is a safe haven idea. A lot of people who are sensitive, it's really helpful to have some place where it's really low, a shielded place or a special place they can go to. Just having some place, a safe haven, is really important in a lot of cases, I find, for sensitive people. I do have some information on safety levels. That's in another one of the PDFs, what EMF level is safe, and some of the reasons, not only what you might consider for safety levels, but where the studies that comes from. So consider 2 different kinds of safety guidelines when you're doing this. Like if you're helping people with this, I have one kind is the proactive kind, and one kind of safety level I consider is for the more hypersensitive people. General precautionary level is more proactive, preventive. You're trying to prevent cancer, and it's more for healthy, robust people who are not having serious health issues. And then there's the hypersensitivity level, where you might want to make sure you're trying to get the levels lower. And some of you watching this might be that you have to get to the lower levels, what I call the hypersensitivity levels. You might have some active symptoms. You might be in treatment. You might have chronic health issues, be highly sensitive. You might need to heal other health problems. In other words, it's kind of depending on your needs, you may have to, how do you put this? The proactive public precautionary levels are a little easier to achieve with a little attention. The hypersensitivity levels are much more challenging because you're trying to make a really clean living environment in a relatively EMF polluted world. And I consider that the sensitive ones who are struggling are our teachers. It's good to listen to them. Their experience and understanding is often well ahead of the current research. And remember, you might be electrosensitive, not crazy. So in the last minutes here, just give you a couple examples of some of the people that have been affected by EMFs that I've worked with. A couple of these are doctors. Here we have a medical doctor. He figured out his EMF sensitivity partly because he's a wilderness guide and how better he'd feel when he got out into nature. He confirmed his sensitivity by having a friend turn on and off a router, and he could track his symptoms, like a double-blind kind of test. In his case, we rewired the house, shielded the house, removed wireless things, and that has allowed him to function and function in the world for being as sensitive as he is. He has a part on the website now. It's the Doctor's Corner at my website, which you could see some of his information. Another doctor, a retired veterinarian, horse lover, very active, health-conscious guy. He had a room of supplements. I swear, this guy was like into every health thing. So he was really surprised when suddenly he was experiencing heart arrhythmias, really serious ones. 3 trips to the emergency room where they put the paddles on him to get his heart working right again. The third time it happened and he's in the emergency room, he realized every episode occurred when he was at his computer. So he had me come out. His computer was making a very high electric field. It resulted in 12 volts. These are AC volts measured on his skin. It's what we call a body voltage test, which we'll deal with. We'll talk about in the 4th session. All we did was ground his iMac, shielded the wiring, removed some wireless, got his exposure from 12 volts down to like 0.1 volts. And he is sure that that was the cause of his heart arrhythmias. And I don't doubt that. Elizabeth, extreme condition of multiple chemical sensitivity. She she lived in a remote area, what I call a metal compound, metal buildings, because that's sometimes what people with chemical sensitivity do, because they can't handle the plastics and fumes from things. Turned out, at 80 years, she discovered she had electrical sensitivity, and it turned out that she had all kinds of magnetic field issues related to her metal housing. And basically the repair there was repair the wiring, stop the magnetic fields. But also she was so sensitive, we had devised a very unique minimalist sort of wiring scheme. And she would actually use a stick to turn, not touch the switches because she was so sensitive, use like a 4-foot stick to turn off the switch for the whole building or the whole bedroom before she'd enter it, so that there'd be no fields in it. And then if she come out, she could turn it on again, like for the refrigerator to run in the refrigerator room, that kind of thing. So some people go to really extreme levels when they get really sensitive. But she managed then to actually do quite well. That was the woman I had mentioned who, like 6 days in, still said she wasn't feeling good. And like the 7th day, about a week later, this is the miracle. Thank you. Another client, Laura, a health activist. Turns out that, and I've seen this actually for many people who are active in doing things like fighting cell towers and smart meters, they have experience of feeling troubled by electromagnetic fields. Turned out she slept for over a decade in a very high electric field, around 10 volts AC on her skin. A very high voltage. Did this help create her RF sensitivity? I think it's very likely, because the dirty electricity she would have gotten through that electric field would have made her one of the first people to experience strong RF signals on her body before all the wireless devices came out that we're now using today. And I see this over and over again in sensitive people. Often they slept for many years in some really strong electric fields. And Dr. Dennis, a really physically fit, active chiropractor struggling with Lyme disease and its issues. And interesting, he owned many electrical healing devices, saunas and massage chairs and biomats and all kinds of different things. Interestingly, he had a huge level of EMFs from all kinds of sources, every kind of source. He had old kind of wiring, knob and tube wiring, which makes higher magnetic fields, higher electric fields. And actually, many of his healing devices were electrical things plugged into the wall. They often had very high electric fields and magnetic fields. So a lot of the work was shielding those devices or getting rid of those devices or unplugging them. But it turned out that some of his highest exposures were actually coming from the healing equipment he was using. So that maybe they were doing one kind of healing, but on an electromagnetic level, unbeknownst to the manufacturers who aren't aware of this issue, were probably maybe contributing to his illness. In his case, rewired the house, did some shielding, removed the wireless, and it made a big difference. So there are, so kind of a review here, there are 3 distinctly different kinds of EMFs, and all 3 are important. ELF stands for extremely low frequency. Our brain waves have very similar frequencies to the micropulsations of the Earth's natural magnetic field. There's 4 important sources here of ELF magnetic fields: power lines, the wiring around you, electrical systems, the Earth itself, and even our brains put out magnetic fields. These are all similar frequencies being used. Consider that EMF scientists have been relatively suppressed and that the actual health impacts may be much more than the studies show. Studies suggest that EMFs may be linked to a variety of health problems, including leukemia, lymphoma, brain cancer, nervous system cancers, melanoma, breast cancer, miscarriage, birth defects, Alzheimer's disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, depression, even suicide. That EMFs are associated with symptoms like nausea and headache, fatigue, anxiety, dizziness, mental confusion, memory loss, sleep disruption, seizures, tinnitus, changes to blood pressure and heart rate, burning skin sensations, skin rashes. And there are increasing numbers of people who are reporting hypersensitivity to electromagnetic fields, similar to the way that many individuals have become hypersensitive to chemicals and other environmental toxins. And then remember that we are also a receiver of magnetic fields, like whales, like slugs, like pigeons, like our own human brains. We have the ability to sense magnetic fields. Natural EMFs are vital to life, and our brains do have a magnetic sense. Perhaps we are messing with nature in that the pineal gland regulates melatonin secretion using these 2 known environmental inputs: visible light, in particular the blue light, and the ELF micropulsations of the Earth's magnetic field. The pineal gland then uses that input to regulate the day-night patterns of all the other glands. The safety standards for protecting computers and electronics, as far as frequency interference is concerned, are stricter for those devices than they are for human life at this point. Conventional science, and that's because conventional science is still using a heating model, while the real EMF mechanism is probably electromagnetic interference with our natural biomagnetic processes. Once you consider the possibility of interference effects, the seemingly low levels of EMF that are reported in studies make sense that they can have huge impacts, disrupting sleep, suppressing the immune system, even increasing cancer. And the biological mechanisms now become more obvious because you're looking at interference issues, there's a lot of ways that interference can happen, much more than just this particular example I'm using of the pineal gland sensing the magnetic field pulsations of the planet. There's a lot of other electromagnetic processes in the body. Probably most of them we don't even have any idea about yet scientifically. So consider 2 different kinds of safety levels when you're working with people or for yourself. Do you need a proactive kind of protection where you're just kind of getting things better than average and good enough? Or do you need a hypersensitivity kind of level where you have to get things really low? You have to go through much more steps to lower the level. And remember that the sensitive ones who are struggling with EMFs are good teachers to listen to. Their experience and understanding is often well ahead of the curve compared to the current scientific research. So in the next session, just to let you know what we'll be doing, we're going to be talking about magnetic fields, how to test and reduce the ELF magnetic fields. So we're going to be talking a little bit why we need to do that. What are ELF fields? What are VLF magnetic fields? We're going to start getting now into what can we do about it. We'll be looking at the proper test instruments, test protocols, the exposure level guidelines. Again, that proactive versus the hypersensitive levels. Common sources, which are the commonest, are the power lines and wiring errors in electrical systems. There's other things too, but those are the biggest ones. And then how to reduce those field exposures. And just a little clue, for a lot of magnetic fields, distance is the best thing you can do. Often works better than shielding. Shielding methods and materials, what works, what doesn't, that's the kind of thing we'll be doing in the course. For instance, we'll be going into some of these safety levels for magnetic fields. What level is harmful? What level is linked to cancer? What level do hypersensitive people probably need? And we're going to start looking at test meters. Test meters are our eyes and ears for finding the EMFs. Using the test meters is probably the best way to open your eyes and ears to something that you can't normally see. And once you do that, the EMFs suddenly become more obvious and are no longer hidden or mysterious. And the big thing about that is much of what to do about it now becomes obvious. We can reduce EMFs and create a more natural, healthy environment. And I'd like to open it up again if people want to ask any questions. I'd love to take questions, first of all, on the subject today, but if anything, and also welcome you to send in your questions email to me ahead of time so I can include them in the presentation also. So hello, everybody. If you want, you can go ahead and chat. I'd love to hear if there's anything on your mind. And we'll just give it a few minutes here. It's kind of quiet on this end. Okay, let's see. I'm looking over the chat questions. Still working on the audio. Okay, that's like the last thing. Looks like maybe there's no questions, but we'll just hang on for a second, and sometimes it takes a few minutes. It's so good to have everybody. Sorry again for the technical glitches at the beginning. And that was basically some of the codes getting changed so that it was harder for you to access. So we had to redo the coding at the last second there, but thank you for all hanging in and finding. For those of us who are sensitive, will you be recommending meters to own? Yes. Yes, and if you don't feel like I've answered that question, please let me know. If you're sensitive, I already pretty much, it'll depend on what you want to do, if you're just doing it for you or if you're trying to help others too. But basically, the 3 meters that we'd recommend for this are the ones that are on our website. And actually for sensitive people, the Acousticom, even though it's a relatively lower cost meter, it has a really, it's about the lowest, how do you say it, the most sensitive one out there right now, as far as how low it goes in sensing radio frequencies, even better than its kind of parent, the bigger one, the Acoustimeter. The Acousticom is actually a little more sensitive, so it's kind of perfect for sensitive people, because sensitive people want to like get something like a meter like the Acousticom to just say clear, no green LEDs, no LEDs. Even though the Acoustimeter and the Acousticom say at the lower levels that they show green LEDs, that's okay. For sensitive people, no, don't find that to be true. So it's a great little meter to take around and try to find places where there's nothing registers. But we'll get into that more as we get into okay, looking at the chats for those who are sensitive. Okay. Is it possible for electric field to exist in the absence of magnetic and RF fields? Yes. Yes. Hi, thanks, Bo. Definitely. So all of these 3 EMFs can act actually quite independently. So you might, it's interesting, like you might notice that the radio frequency is actually an electromagnetic field either, but the electric part and the magnetic part don't separate as easily. It has to do with the size of it. Like you might remember that the Wi-Fi router, that the size of that wavelength is 5 inches. So it's so physically, you can kind of think of it as like you're outside of the field. You're like bigger than it. And the electric and magnetic fields are kind of stuck together. So that's why we only have one measurement for the radio frequency field. We only need to take one measurement. When you know the electric field part of the RF, you know the magnetic field, or if you know the magnetic field part, you know the electric part. So you just actually have one measurement. And for the ELF fields, it's different. Those are the wavelengths that are, 20,000 miles. So you're like inside of the field. It's not, you're much smaller than it. And it's almost like you can walk into the magnetic room or you can walk into the electric room of the field. So you can have a very high ELF magnetic field and a completely low ELF electric field, and vice versa. You could have either way, or you can have both high. So yeah, totally independent for the ELF and the VLF frequencies. Bo, I seem to have that situation in front of my desktop. Yes, so the typical thing that you'll have is, for most people, the average situation will be relatively low magnetic fields and relatively high electric fields. And that has to do with because your wiring and the devices you're using tend to have a magnetic field that drops very quickly with distance. And you have to be really near the electric cord or the wires in the wall or the device, like your computer. You have to be very close to it to get the magnetic field. But the electric field tends to spread out more. So you could be 4 feet away from the wall and the magnetic field from the wiring disappeared at 6 inches, but you're still getting that electric field fairly strong. So it's a fairly common thing for electric fields to be an important, a relatively strong field for people, even if the magnetic isn't. What is the best way to test for dirty electricity? Great. That's going to be session 5. Can't get into it too much now, but just to give you a little head start, they're the dirty electricity meters. So we have the meters that come from the Stetzer meter, the Graham-Stetzer tester, and Greenwave. They're both good, but they're actually only measuring part of the dirty electricity. So the problem with the way that it's done right now is that the typical things out there for measuring dirty electricity are measuring what I would call dirty voltage, and it has to do with the electric fields that are coming from the wiring, but it does not measure the dirty current, which is the magnetic fields coming from the wiring. So we'll get into that in the 5th session, where we actually focus a lot on dirty electricity. It's a very important issue. My concern is that the way it's measured and then the way it's corrected tends to be problematic. And in fact, in some cases, the correction, even though it makes the dirty voltage better, it often makes the dirty magnetic worse. So there's people who have used the filters, and it's actually removing their filters that helps them recover, because their filters in their particular case were increasing the magnetic field significantly. So I would hold off on testing dirty electricity yet, because it's a little more complicated, and I keep it for towards the end of the course too, so you have a good understanding of the other three, the 3 fields: electric fields, magnetic fields, and radio frequency fields. With that knowledge, it'll be a little easier to understand how the dirty electricity works. And the quick thing is, dirty electricity itself is not a field so much. It's more trying to measure the quality of the electrical system and the fields that come from it. So you have an electric field that comes from your wires. Their dirty electricity really tells you how irregular, or we call dirty, that signal is. So if you reduce the electric field itself, you've actually taken not only the kind of toxic electric field away, but the added toxic thing of the dirty electricity that was coming along with it. So the dirty electricity signals, those radio frequency signals, were piggybacking along with that electric field. And if you reduce the electric field, you've reduced that piggybacking. So I find that the best way to reduce dirty electricity is usually to actually reduce the electric field. It still is good to reduce dirty electricity, but you have to be careful. So I tend to put much more emphasis on first dealing with the electric fields, and then after that, I start looking at dirty electricity if it's still an issue. These are all really great questions. Thank you all. Not sure. We're just going to go another minute here in case anybody else has anything they want to ask. So good to have you all. We will be emailing a new link for the next course, and hopefully we'll straighten out that problem with the bad links. And let's see, the replay of this, the recording, should be available to you in about 24 hours. We'll have to, hopefully it'll be a little sooner than that, and hopefully not too much later than that, so that you'll be able to watch this again. And for people that, if your sound didn't work, so that you can hear the presentation, and for the people who didn't, that you can hopefully listen to it before our next session. But it was really great to have all of you here. Thanks so much, everybody, and you take care, and look forward to continuing again next week. And if you have anything that comes up in the meantime, feel free to email me. Yes, Stephanie, sorry if that wasn't clear. Future sessions will be scheduled on Wednesdays at the exact same time. Yeah, so whatever the time is in your time zone, it's the exact same thing next week for 6 weeks in a row, starting today, the exact same time. Okay, very good. Thank you so much. Hope you have a great week, and everybody, you take care.